The 2024 Pro Farmer Crop Tour is presented by Pioneer, combining cutting-edge research with one of the largest local testing programs in the industry to help farmers succeed. Pioneer, what's next happens here. By Zetavo soybean seed, distributed exclusively by BASF, and by New Leaf Symbiotics, science-led, performance-driven, and data-backed, offering biostimulants for corn, soy, cotton, and peanuts, and a revolutionary new bioinsecticide for corn rootworm. The international sponsor for Crop Tour is the U.S. Soybean Export Council. Crop Tour 24 is also supported by RCIS, by Case IH, by Meristem Crop Performance, by Sweetwater Technologies, by Farm Credit Services of America, by Firestone, by Morton Buildings, by Nutrien ESN, and by BW Fusion.
Hello and welcome to Night 2 of Crop Tour Live. I'm Clinton Griffiths, the host of Ag Day and editor of Farm Journal magazine. Today, many of our scouts traveled through areas USDA predict could produce some of the best crops in the entire Corn Belt. Right now, scouts in the west are gathering in Nebraska City, Nebraska, and in the east in Bloomington, Illinois. After a busy day of checking fields, sampling, measuring, and counting, they are about to see the fruits of their labor as we reveal the corn and soybean yield averages for both Indiana and Nebraska. But before we get to those, let's bring in our tour leaders. Once again in the west is the host of AgriTalk, Chip Flory, and in the east, Brian Grady, the editor of Pro Farmer. Chip, let's start with you. A different story in Nebraska this year after last year's drought.
We saw everything that a Nebraska growing season has to offer. I mean, we saw evidence that it was too wet during the planting season. We saw some drought on the travels through northeast Nebraska and southeast Nebraska today. We saw hailed out areas, some terrible hail damage in the state of Nebraska. We saw western bean cutworms. We saw irrigated corn that looks really good. We saw some irrigated corn that looks a little sketchy. We saw some dryland corn that it's rivaling anything that's being produced under a pivot this year. We also saw some dryland corn in the mid double digits on yield. So we literally, if a Nebraska growing season has it to offer, we saw it this year.
What about you, Brian? You were in Indiana working your way over to Illinois today. What did you see? What are your takeaways from the day?
Well, there's a lot of ears of corn out there, that's for sure. And they're pretty long as well, but a lot of pods. And USDA put record yields on both the corn and soybean crops coming out of Indiana this year as of August 1. And so, will it live up to those expectations? I think that's the big thing. But, man, there are some really good crops in Indiana this year. They had some struggles through early in the growing season. They came out of it. They've had some other issues, but really, all in all, it's just been a pretty good growing season for them. Temperature-wise, the temps have not been extreme, and they've had moisture. They seemingly got timely rains when they needed them, and the crop really did perform pretty well.
Brian, we've got just a couple of seconds here before we're going to roll out those numbers. As far as disease or pressure goes, did you see anything out there that might start to work on this crop as we go through the rest of the growing season here?
Well, tar spot, I mean, that's the one that's being talked about, and there are some instances of that, obviously, in the state, and so that will be a question as we move forward through the growing season, or into harvest season, I guess.
All right, it's time. It's 8 o'clock again in the Central Time Zone, and time to reveal the numbers as promised. Let's start out in the west with you, Chip, for the corn and soybean numbers out of Nebraska.
Yeah, I'm going to slow you down just about 15 seconds here before we get to the 8 o'clock number on my iPhone anyway. Sorry, don't want to jump the gun, but we saw a really good corn crop out in Nebraska. There's no question about it. And it's one that we're going to remember for some time. 173.25 bushels per acre for the Nebraska yield, up 3.6% from a year ago. Nebraska pod counts 1172.48, up 1.1% from a year ago.
All right, Brian, from your side of things, what did you see out in Indiana?
Indiana corn yield, we calculated 187.54, up 3.7% from a year ago. And soybean pod counts in a 3x3 square, 1409.02, up 7.6% from last year.
All right, Brian, we've got those numbers up. Let's stay there. Talk about Indiana. Go through these numbers, corn first, then soybeans. What surprised you? What are your takeaways?
Well, on my route, we collected 10 samples out of Indiana today, and I think 6 of them were above 200 bushels. The ear populations, 98 was the low, and they went up to 119, and so there's a lot of ear pop out there, like I mentioned. But the grain length is also there, and so it takes ears to build a yield, but it also takes grain length, and it had both of them, and that up 3.7% from a year ago. Last year wasn't the greatest year in Indiana, but to see that year-over-year increase, Indiana has a great corn crop out there.
I know last year there was times where we saw some drought. We saw a little bit of drought stress in different parts of the state. This year it doesn't look like that's necessarily the case. Do we get many reports of dry pockets or extreme wetness as we were going through fields with scouts?
No, I think the story in Indiana this year is every time you saw them start to get a little bit dry on the drought monitor, those timely rains would come through, and then it would recede, and then you would see maybe it build a little bit again, and then the timely rains would come through. And so that's, I think, the key takeaway from that. Now, some of the scouts did mention, and I saw it on my route, that as we got closer to the Illinois border, the soils did dry, topsoils that is, but there's subsoil moisture there. And so I don't think it's a dire situation by any means, just that the topsoils have dried out a little bit at the moment.
All right, what about on the soybean side of things? Obviously moisture is key there to see this crop finish through August. What were, as far as these numbers go, what are your big takeaways for this year?
Well, 1409 is huge.
Right.
Let's just keep that in mind. I mean, that's a big pod number. To put it in perspective, that's the 4th highest that we've ever had on Crop Tour for 32 years of data there, and it's the highest since 2002, so 2002, so yeah, it's just a heavily potted crop. Now it's getting it to the finish line, and the moisture that it needs. In some of those drier areas, it probably needs another rain, maybe 2. In some of the areas that has ample moisture, they probably could get to the finish line, and I think that's the critical thing. Just because it's a heavily potted crop doesn't mean it's going to be a record yield. It just means that there's a really big factory out there for it to build a big yield.
Perfect. All right, Chip. Let's jump over to the numbers there in Nebraska. Obviously, we'll throw those back up on the screen. Talk to me about these. What strikes you as you look at these numbers compared to what you've seen in previous years, especially last year?
Yeah, as I take a look at we've got two there. Oh, I see what's going on. I'm sorry. When we take a look at what's going on with the Nebraska corn, we're looking at that 173.25. Now, USDA on August 1 had the crop at 194, which would equal the record, but that was up 6.6% from 2023. The yield that we saw this year was up 3.6%. Now, the biggest Nebraska corn yield that we have seen on tour came in 2021, and that was 182 bushels per acre. We're 9 bushels under that.
Interesting. So as far as like finishing this crop out, do you think we get there?
Oh yeah. There's some corn in the northeast part of the state that leaves me a little concerned, but that's in the far northern part of the state. For the most part, I think the Nebraska corn crop's going to be okay. Everything that we saw today south of the Platte River is going to be, it'll make it home. It will get home before the end of the season. Some of the corn could still benefit from a rain. There's no question about that. a lot of the soybeans could still benefit from rain. And it's similar to what we saw yesterday up in South Dakota. Compared to a year ago, this bean crop has got a lot of work to do yet to build a yield.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about that bean crop. Obviously, we saw those numbers there. Pretty decent, 1172 on a 3x3 foot square there, up about 1% year over year.
Right.
What are your, obviously moisture is a big difference. That's the biggest change.
Yeah, absolutely. The bean crop for the most part, has got some moisture to finish, better than what we saw a year ago by a long shot. It doesn't mean that it's got enough to reach its full potential. It still needs some water out here to reach its full potential. And I know when you look at a big increase in that moisture index that we should, you probably think that, well, this crop has got it made. All it's got to do is get to maturity before the first frost. We could still use the rain out in Nebraska. I don't think there's any question about that.
All right, appreciate it, guys. Thanks for giving us a rundown of what you saw, comparing those to the numbers that we've just revealed here. Better news overall out of Nebraska this year. That doesn't mean that there aren't some of those concern areas, as you mentioned, Chip. The western leg traveling today from Grand Island to Nebraska City. Farm Journal's Michelle Rook continuing to follow the tour for us.
Moisture and crop conditions here in Nebraska are much improved over last year, where we saw widespread heat and drought stress. However, crop scouts are trying to determine if issues such as hail will trim overall yield potential in the state, which is set at near to record levels. What a difference a year makes. Last year, crop scouts encountered drought in most of eastern Nebraska, which impacted even irrigated crops.
I think this year there's a huge difference in moisture level.
And corn yields were uniform on their route from north to south.
Dry lands had pretty good rain in northeast Nebraska, so we saw consistent yields, 180 to 200, even dry land yields. Today we're in southeast Nebraska. Been very consistent again. Irrigated yields have been 200, give or take.
They did see some damage from earworms and western bean cutworm, but disease pressure was light. But that's not true everywhere.
A lot of areas are talking southern rust. We're certainly seeing it in south central Nebraska come in. A couple weeks ago, really started to flare up.
There's 42 plants in this foot. I've never had that many before.
Soybean yield potential also looks like it could exceed 2023 with better moisture and only a trace of pest problems.
This year we've caught in some of that range. We've had cooler temperatures. It hasn't been hot. The beans have handled it well.
We're finding more pods, and the pods look like a lot of 3-4 beans. They're coming along really well this year. Beans look really good.
But the big caveat for both crops is hail damage, like in Clay County.
We came through this area here and looked for it. I knew it was here. It's 20, 30,000 acres. They said in Phelps County it was 400,000 acres.
So will that prevent Nebraska from hitting the 59 bushel soybean and 194 record corn yield predicted? Judah says it depends on how many acres were zeroed out.
To zero, it's going to be really hard to get to that top yield when all them acres are going to have to come out of the equation.
All right, thanks, Michelle. In the east, USDA forecasting record corn and soybean crops for the Hoosier State. Farm Journal's Ty Morgan reports based on what scouts saw, USDA's estimates may not be too far off.
As the moon set and the sun peeked over the horizon on day 2 of crop tour, these scouts were already striding through Indiana fields, uncovering one of the better crops they've seen.
When we got into Indiana, our pod counts went way up yesterday afternoon. And then this morning, we're getting really good pod counts.
With pod counts pushing higher and consistent crops in field after field, scouts in the east were impressed with what they saw on crop tour Tuesday.
If the trend continues and the other routes see what we're seeing, Indiana has potential for a record bean crop.
And in the corn, ear after ear,
the corn this morning has been really good.
Scouts also found high yield potential.
On the routes I've been on in Indiana on the corn it's been pretty consistent.
As ear counts and grain length were both up.
The 3 ears were between 8 and 9 inches, each one of them. They're real good ear count. The one thing that's going to hurt it a little bit is they were only 16 in diameter.
While the route did produce a couple anomalies,
this isn't quite normal. for all the weeds in here. There's a lot of giant ragweed in this field.
Those trouble spots were few and far between. USDA currently has Indiana's statewide corn yield projected at 207 bushels per acre, a 2% increase over last year, with beans at 62 bushels per acre, a 1.6% increase from 2023. And if you ask local agronomists,
it's a bumper crop.
The stage is set for this crop to top last year's yields.
I'd say we're better off this year compared to last year because we had that extended period of dry weather last year where I thought things were almost going to start dying in the field.
Other than some high winds impacting small pockets of cornfields and a few cases of white mold starting to creep in for soybeans, Bruner says 2024 looks to be a bumper crop.
What I've seen says that, and the guys I've talked to, how are their crops looking? So far, fingers crossed, the diseases aren't there, the bugs aren't there, the weather's been good. Everything's set up pretty daggone good right now.
All right, thanks, Tyne. Love looking at those overhead views of those fields, guys. Just some incredible crops out there. We did this yesterday. Brian, what would you like to ask Chip about what he saw in Nebraska?
Well, Chip, you talked about the wide array of everything that the Nebraska crops have faced this year. Was it greater than you expected, worse than you expected, greater than normal? Give us some perspective on
Well, I think it was basically as we expected because we expected the extremes. We knew that there were some areas out there where the hail damage was just absolutely terrible. We knew that there was going to be really good corn in the state based on what Pro Farmer members have been telling us and what we've been hearing from my Agri-Talk guests and right down the line. So we knew that both extremes were going to be here. I guess one thing that surprises me is that through South Dakota and through Nebraska out here on the Western Leg Beach, we haven't pulled a zero. And based on some of the conditions that we had early in the growing season, and there was some ponding in northeast Nebraska, there was some ponding in southeast South Dakota. I kind of figured that somebody would pull the short straw and end up in a zero spot, and we haven't done that yet.
What about on the flip side, Chip? What would you like to ask Brian about what he's seen out in Indiana?
Okay, which is better, Indiana's corn crop this year or Ohio's corn crop last year?
I liked Ohio's corn crop last year. I'll go with Ohio's corn.
I'm trying to find something else.
No, I loved it. I loved it last year. I told you, and it turned out a record, right?
It did.
It was impressive.
Well, I know there's still quite a lot of ground to cover, fellas. We're going to drive a lot of miles here before the end of the week. Talk to me about what you expect to see tomorrow. We've got about 20 seconds on each side. Brian, what are you looking for as you go through the rest of Illinois?
Well, 225, that's the number that USDA put on the Illinois corn yield, and we need to find some really, really big yields out there to support that. So that is the key question moving into Illinois and through Illinois. How big is that crop? Because that one is a large number.
What about you, Chip, as we start to look at Iowa tomorrow? What are your expectations?
Southwest Iowa caught some very timely rains just a week ago. I feel good about what we're going to see there. Remember, West Central Iowa was kind of our downer spot a year ago. I think that part of the state's going to make a nice recovery. And then we get into the floods and the ponding. We'll get back into that in the northwest part of the state.
All right, guys. Sure appreciate you taking a few minutes for us. We'll let you get back into the room to answer some questions. Meanwhile, scouts on the Pro Farmer Crop Tour will be dodging some raindrops tomorrow, but that may be just what some of those crops need. Meteorologist Matt Engelbrecht has a look ahead for us.
Oh, here's another look at that crop tour forecast. Really, what we're going to be watching for is the potential for maybe some light showers the first half of the day as we get set for our Wednesday. So again, this is Wednesday at 7 a.m. See the green back behind me here as we go forward. Not seeing much progress to the east with showers during this route. Rather, these showers are going to be going more north to the south as they're going to be riding around a ridge of high pressure. A ridge of high pressure that's going to keep things pretty quiet if we're talking Iowa City or even Bloomington, Illinois. As for our Wednesday, if we look a little bit closer towards Nebraska City and Spencer, may pick up those scattered showers. And remember, we're moving these from the north to the south. So the first half of the day on Wednesday may have a few showers, and then as we get later in the afternoon, most of those showers hug back off into the west.
All right, thanks, Matt. And while we've reached the halfway point on the tour, there's much more to see. Tomorrow, scouts in the west will leave Nebraska City, fan out before arriving in Spencer, Iowa. While in the east, they will travel from Bloomington, also en route to Iowa, and end in Iowa City. And tomorrow, we'll bring you the results from Illinois and the western half of Iowa. So make sure to join us right back here once again tomorrow night, shortly before 8 o'clock Central Time or 7:55 for day 3 of Crop Tour Live and the Pro Farmer Crop Tour. Good night, everyone.